What's up, amigos? Welcome back to the Starts and Sits for Week 5 of the 2015 NFL season. I'm your host, Greg Smith, at Greg Sauce on Twitter. And as always, we will recap last week's picks first before we get to this week's choices. Quarterbacks. Tyrod Taylor, QB 19, 14.5 points. Respectable, but not great. Definitely a starter in 2 QB leagues, but I had him pegged as a top 10 guy. Didn't get there. Just in general, the Bills disappointed me last week. Andy Dalton, however, QB 8 with 18.4 points. He was solid. Derek Carr, I think a lot of people were on this pick. QB 23, 13.8 points. Again, startable for 2 QBers. Not so great if you were expecting a top 10 or top 12 performance. Fitzpatrick definitely fit the 2 QB bill. I tapped him for quarterback 21 with 14.1 points in kind of an ugly game across the pond. Blake Bortles, QB 6 with 19 points. That was a good call. Maybe I should have listed him for 1 QB leagues. Who knows? On the other side, I whiffed on Sam Bradford. QB 2, 24.2 points. Where did that come from? He may be turning the corner a little bit. Matchups are starting to look pretty good this week in particular. We'll get to that later. Ryan Tannehill, QB 26. In that same game with Ryan Fitzpatrick, Tanny did not look good against a really good, solid Jets defense. Alex Smith, QB 10. I thought that the Bengals defense would put up a little bit more of a fight against the Chiefs, but Smith got his. He dinked and dunked his way to nearly 18 fantasy points. Matthew Stafford was a good call, QB 29 with only 8.1. It wasn't too tough of a call. That matchup against Seattle was very unfavorable. And Teddy Bridgewater overperformed my expectations, QB 18 with 15.1 points against the Denver defense. He just is an enigma, man. I don't know how to predict that guy week to week. Running backs up next. Latavius Murray. What happened, buddy? RB44, 4.1 points. That's not very good. Carlos Williams, everyone was saying to start him, and he rewarded that with top 20 performance, 13 points. Joseph Randle, RB28, 8.6. I really thought the Cowboys would run it more against the Saints. And Brandon Weeden ended up being okay, and he, made Terrence Williams playable as well. I just had the script wrong there, unfortunately. And speaking of having the wrong script, Melvin Gordon, this ties directly with my pick against Isaiah Crowell across the page here on the sit side. I really expected San Diego to take care of business against the Browns, and they didn't do that, and essentially the running back production was flip-flopped. I said that Crowell was in the bizarro situation of Melvin Gordon, and the whole situation was the bizarro world version of what I expected. Gio Bernard was a nice call, RB20 with 12.2 points, and Ronnie Hillman, dart throw, came pretty close to the bullseye there, RB8 with 16.8 points. Definitely was bailed out by that one big play, though, so let's not read too much into that, although I do think that Hillman has kind of asserted himself as the back you want to own in Denver. Other sits, Lamar Miller was a good call. Like Tannehill, he was limited against the Jets, only 3.6 points. Doug Martin, that was a colossal miss. He was the 5th best running back in Week 4 with 20.3 points. Alfred Morris, just in general, the Redskins running backs are not guys that you want to be dealing with right now. Now that Chris Thompson has entered the mix, it's just a 3-headed monster, and it'll be really hard to predict week to week who's going to, get the goal line work, who's going to get the game script in their favor. I think they're all just kind of guys you want to avoid going forward. Todd Gurley, I was worried about a timeshare, and I'm no longer worried. RB9 finish in Week 4 for 16 points. He will be in my top 10 this week against a soft Green Bay defense. Andre Ellington didn't play, but again, that's kind of baked into when I say to start him on Thursday and Friday. That means if you're hearing that, then start to look for other options. Don't bank on him playing because you might get a DNP. Wide receivers, Moncrief wasn't great, but still put up 7.5 points. James Jones was fine, 9.8 points. John Brown was fine, 8.8 points. Percy Harvin was a bad call. Again, I kind of whiffed on the Bills in general. Really thought that they were going to have an easier time in that game. Michael Crabtree did okay despite missing some time in the game with an injury. 37 among wide receivers for 8 points. Marvin Jones just missed on a big play that would have vaulted him much higher than this wide receiver 96 finish. On the sit side, Brandon Cooks was a good call, only 2.5 points. Golden Tate, similarly, 3.5 points. Again, like Stafford, that was a somewhat easy one to predict. Terrence Williams, I mentioned him earlier. He kind of screwed my prediction here. Wide receiver 20, almost 11 points. Torrey Smith, Ty Montgomery, and Andre Johnson, nothing doing there. I mean, Torrey Smith was okay. 5.5 points, that's not going to kill you. But, you really don't want to be counting on the San Francisco passing game right now if you can help it. Tight ends. Jordan Reed got hurt in his game, finished as tight end 27. Ebron also got hurt, finished as tight end 23. Can't really call those terrible picks, but they didn't work out, unfortunately. Kobe Fleener tied for tight end 1, 14.3 points. Good job by you, Fleener. Kyle Rudolph, tight end 40 with 0.7 points. I really thought that I'd be able to chalk up tight end production against the Denver defense, thinking that they would limit wide receivers. I think in this case, what I didn't factor in enough was just the fact that the Vikings receiving core is so mediocre and depleted that the Broncos could afford to key in on Rudolph as well. So I think maybe in a better offense, one with 2 good wide receivers and a decent tight end, the tight end might be a good play against Denver. But in general, I think it's time to start fading Denver opponents at most positions every week just because their defense is insanely good. On the sit side, Jordan Cameron, like the other Dolphins, did not do well in London. Zach Ertz also did not do well, tight end 35. Vernon Davis didn't play. Gary Barnidge, man, he may be the real deal. I think he faces a truer test this week against a Ravens team that has limited tight ends very well. But he finished as tight end 3 last week with 13.5 points. I think as long as McCown is the QB there, you have to consider Barnidge a solid play moving forward. Maybe not a top 10 guy every week, but probably a top 15 guy. And if you had a guy like Jordan Reed or Eric Ebron, and you can still audible over to Barnidge, that could be a good solution for you moving forward. So once again, we'll move next in the start sits to the Game Flowbotics spreadsheet. We're looking at DVOA numbers. We're looking at Vegas lines and totals. We're looking at injury news. And one thing before we jump into this I want to highlight are these links up at the top. And one I want to look at are these fantasy scoring leaders, just to kind of give an idea more of what we're looking at on a week-to-week basis. These are the scoring leaders from Fantasy Pros. I refer to them on the spreadsheet, if only because they use a very standard scoring setup. And this is where most rankings are compared against each other within the fantasy industry. And just for grins, I kind of want to take a look at what we're trying to do with these start sits and look at some of the scoring leaders here. Like last week, we're looking at wide receivers, and I'm cherry picking this example because it kind of goes to show how, variable fantasy football is. But Tavon Austin, wide receiver number 1, Alan Hearns, number 3, Leonard Hankerson, number 4. We're trying to hit on calls like that with the start sits. So these aren't necessarily the automatic starts like Vincent Jackson, like DeAndre Hopkins, like Jeremy Maclin. And I obviously didn't get these guys as tabbed as starts last week, Austin and Hankerson and so on. But these are the types of plays we're looking for. Digging a little deeper, finding guys that are fringe who could vault themselves up into starter status. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're going through this because, just for example, later on when I say to start Jamison Crowder this week, and I will, I'm also essentially saying to start Pierre Garçon and to maybe even consider Kirk Cousins in a 2 QB league. What I'm saying when I pick a deeper Washington receiver like that is not just that Crowder's the only guy. I hope that he's the one guy who kind of outperforms expectations more than anyone else. But just in general, I think that there's a matchup to exploit there. And you can consider that because maybe you don't have access to Crowder. Someone else in your league picked him up. But if you have Garçon, if I say I like Crowder, that's a good indication that you should be starting Garçon. So keep that in mind as we go through these starts and sits. I'm trying to avoid the obvious ones, although when some chalk plays like Carlos Williams last week come up, I am going to mention those as well from time to time. But just in general, if you are interested in like who you think I should start between 2 specific players, that's not what these starts and sit are about. That's what the rankings are about, and you can find those on the spreadsheet as well. Right here at the Fake Football, these are our staff rankings. You can also use Fantasy Pros. You can use whoever's rankings you want. You can make up your own. And I do think that that's what you should ultimately be trying to do, is take in all these factors, all these inputs, and use it to create your own opinions, your own rankings. become your own expert for what it's worth. And that's why I make all this stuff public. I mean, I work full time. I am not a fantasy writer by trade, but I do enjoy playing, and I feel like I've played long enough, and I've developed my own strategies long enough, and I can absorb all the input through Twitter, through rankings, etc., to come up with, some advice that hopefully will be actionable to you, and not only actionable, but will kind of show you the thought process behind it, so you can start to make these decisions on your own. I feel like I'm rambling. Let's get to the starts and sits. We'll start with Chicago and Kansas City. Kansas City heavy favorites here at home. With that in mind, I'm actually going to say start Jay Cutler. This is more a call for 2 QB leagues. The Chiefs have been, up until last week, they had been pretty good against the run. In general, their matchups this season have been tough. Going up against the Bears is not quite as tough of a matchup. I think that the KC defense is a nice play here. But with that said, Jay Cutler is probably going to have to sling it to keep up and maintain, offense against a team that's favored by this much. And the Chiefs have struggled against the pass. They're the 30th ranked team in terms of passing defense DVOA. So that's a matchup you can exploit with Cutler. Alshon Jeffrey, too, if he plays, I think is a fine option this week. And as always, you're starting Martellus Bennett if you have him. Next up, let's go to the Seahawks and the Bengals in Cincinnati. Probably the best matchup of the week. Cincinnati 4-0. Seahawks didn't look that good last week. That offensive line has some holes in it. They were having trouble, blocking 4 guys with 5 blockers. I noted that on Twitter while I was watching the game. It hasn't been pretty. I mean, Russell Wilson is kind of a magician once he's, in and then out of the pocket and then back into it. He can extend a lot of plays and make up for a lot of those problems on the offensive line. But with that said, Cincinnati is a little bit more of a legit defense than the Detroit Lions. So with that said, I think you need to temper your expectations with the Seahawks this week. On the Cincinnati side of the ball, Andy Dalton's been great. But I do think the Seahawks defense is legit. Cam Chancellor coming back helps them out a lot. We've seen that already just with how they smothered the Lions last week. Dalton is a sit for me this week. I'm staying away. Despite his solid start, his schedule is about to be pretty heinous, and I think that just because he was good the first 4 weeks, don't buy too much into that. His matchups were nice, and with a tougher schedule, he might be more of the mediocre Andy Dalton that we're used to. In particular, the Seahawks have the 15th ranked passing defense in terms of DVOA, but that's again factoring in the fact that Cam Chancellor was out for the first couple games. One other thing to note in this matchup, and I don't think this is actionable in terms of start or sit, is that the Bengals have been very good at rushing the ball with Gio Bernard and Jeremy Hill. The Seahawks rushing defense, again, grain of salt because Cam Chancellor didn't play for the first couple games, but 15th ranked in the league in terms of rushing defense, the Seahawks are. So I don't think you should be too afraid to use those Bengals running backs, especially at home in a game where they're favored. Let's move now to Washington and Atlanta. Atlanta, big favorites at home. Pretty high over-under, 48 total points. We should see some passing in this game. With that in mind, starts a lot of the passing options. We talked about Pierre Garçon and Jamison Crowder earlier, but I like Leonard Hankerson here as well. I recommended him in a waiver wire article for Fantasy Pros earlier this week. Probably my top waiver wire pickup, except for maybe Allen Hurns or Duke Johnson. He's the wide receiver 2 in Atlanta. The Washington defense is very bad against the pass, 21st ranked in the league. And by contrast, Washington is very good against the run, 7th ranked in the league. So the Falcons will be incentivized to throw, and Washington will key on Julio Jones. Hopefully that'll open things up for Leonard Hankerson, make this a good call, let him see another top 20 finish like he did last week. Next up, the Jags and the Bucks. Looking through my rankings, I saw a lot of players that I liked in this game relative to where I'd expect them to be ranked. The over-under is pretty low here at 42, and the Bucks are barely favored, 2.5 points. So with these starts and sits, I have recommended a lot of players to start here. Blake Bortles as a 2 QB option, TJ Yeldon, Allen Robinson, also for the Jags. On the Bucks, I like Charles Sims in PPR leagues. I should specify that this is specifically a PPR call. And Doug Martin, this is a nice matchup. The Jags have actually been fairly good against the run. 4th in the league. So I'm not super sold on Martin as a surefire start, but I think you can get away with playing him if you need to. In general, I'm worried that I have, a little too much action on this game considering the low total. But, both of these defenses are somewhat mediocre, and I do think that Bortles will pass the ball. I think this is a good opportunity for Allen Robinson to get some run relative to some tougher matchups he's faced in recent weeks. Allen Hurns is a fine, deep option as he was, the last couple weeks. But I think this is going to be more of an Allen Robinson game. Fingers crossed. I own him in a few leagues. So maybe this is wishful thinking. I am a little more skeptical about some of these calls than the other ones we'll get to. But, this is how my rankings, or these are how my rankings broke out for this week. I had these guys all ranked a little higher than I expected. And I wanted to reflect that here in the starts and sits. Next up, New Orleans and Philadelphia, 49.5 point over under. Let's get ready for some fireworks, hopefully. Sam Bradford, he proved me wrong last week. He was a good start. I expect him to be a good start again this week. The Saints have the worst passing defense in the league, according to DVOA. So with that in mind, I think Bradford and his receivers, J. Matt, I think is a definite starter this week. Aguilar, if you want to dig a little deeper, I'm not going to list him as a start, but he seems fine. Zach Ertz is a guy I'm typically down on week to week, but tight end is fickle, and maybe this is the week when he catches a touchdown. On the sit side, I'm avoiding DeMarco Murray. Things just haven't looked good for him. He's whining about not getting the ball enough now. And I don't know if Chip Kelly is the type of coach to respond to that in a good way for Murray's sake. I would worry that, he might see the ball less, and maybe Ryan Matthews and Darren Sproles will get a little bit more run. Just in general, based on the high-scoring, prospects of this game and based on what figures to be a lot of passing, Sproles is probably the running back for the Eagles to deploy this week. I'm also recommending a sit of Brandon Cooks. I just talked about how passing is probably going to be plentiful in this game. But with that said, this is less about Cooks being unusable versus Cooks being a guy that is further down my rankings than some other names. And I urge you to check out the rankings to see where he falls. But I think he came in like the 30s somewhere. And, if we're looking for fantasy starters, we want guys that are ranked, top 20, top 30, not outside of that top 30. And Cooks fell out of there, so he's a sit for me. This is kind of a relative value thing. He might be fine. If you're looking for a flex play, he could fit that bill, but he's not a guy that I love this week relative to some of the other options. And some of the more readily available options, like waiver wire pickups, Leonard Hankerson, Kamar Aiken, etc. We'll go next to an inter-division rivalry here, the Browns and the Ravens. Both teams 1-3, Baltimore at home, favored by almost a touchdown, low over-under here, so things don't figure to work out well for Cleveland in this game, according to the Vegas numbers. I would expect Baltimore to kind of cruise to victory here, lean on the running game a little bit, especially considering how banged up their wide receivers are. Noting that Kamar Aiken is a start for me. I think that as the only, proven, and I have air quotes here, proven wide receiver, and proven this season, that Joe Flacco can throw to, he doesn't really have a whole lot of other options. If Crockett Gilmore plays, then I like him this week. Another start for me is Travis Benjamin. The Browns have shown that they're going to go to him over and over again. They're going to use him a lot. He plays with a lot of energy, and, he has great breakaway speed. If he can get a big touchdown, the Baltimore Ravens secondary might be the team to do it against. Also, a sit for me, Isaiah Crowell. And the matchup is not terrible here. The Baltimore Ravens are only 18th against the rush in terms of DVOA, but Crowell keeps ceding more and more touches to Duke Johnson, and I think that bodes poorly for him, Crowell, that is. I think you should avoid him if you can and try to find other running back options. St. Louis and Green Bay next up. Big favorites, Green Bay here, 9 points. 46 over-under is a middling total. There should be some scoring in this game. What do we make of the DVOA rankings here? Green Bay is obviously a very good passing team. St. Louis has a good passing defense, 9th in the league. Green Bay's rushing offense is also proven to be very good, 6th in the league. The Rams' rushing defense not quite as good in terms of ranking as their passing defense, 13th in the league. Just in general, the defense is good. Their running game is solid, and with Gurley, I think that adds a whole new element. I worry that Gurley might be a bit of a victim of game flow here. If the Packers, look at this matchup and say, okay, well, the Rams defense is pretty good, but we're a better passing team than we are a running team. Let's pass the hell out of the ball. Let's score quick, score early, jump out to a lead. How much play is Gurley going to get if that happens? I don't know. It's tough to say. With that said, the Packers' rushing defense has been so bad, 31st in the league in terms of DVOA. I think you have to start Gurley if you have him after what he flashed last week against a good Cardinals defense. So he's a sit. He's a start for me. On the sit side, I'm avoiding Richard Rodgers and Kenny Britt. Rodgers just more because I like a lot of the other tight end options more. Check out the rankings to see who those guys are. Kenny Britt, I recommended him in a similar, game flow sort of scenario a while back against the Steelers, and he produced fairly well. The Steelers defense is a lot worse than the Packers defense, and particularly in terms of passing defense, the Packers have been 5th in the league this season. So Kenny Britt, Nick Foles, no thanks. Jared Cook is a guy I'm mildly interested in, if only because despite this good pass defense, the Packers have given up a fair number of points to tight ends this season. But I'm not specifically recommending him as a start. I think he's somewhere in the 12 to 15 range among tight ends for me this week. Let's go next to Buffalo and Tennessee. Buffalo road favorites here, low total, 42 points. This has the makings of an ugly game. Buffalo coming off a relatively poor performance. Tennessee coming off a bye here. I'm surprised to see them underdogs at home. I know there's a lot of hype around Buffalo and that their defense has generally been very good this season. But this game figures to be a little closer to me than one might expect. In terms of starts and sits, I like Boobie Dixon, if only because of volume here. There are some rumblings that, he might not get the full workload that, Carlos Williams or LaShawn McCoy would have gotten. So exercise a little bit of caution when using him. I wouldn't start him over more proven commodities, but he's probably still a top 24 guy if he gets, 15 to 18 touches. Charles Clay at tight end for the Bills, he just seems to have Tyrod's trust. And, with Sammy Watkins still dinged up, Clay and Harvin are the two primary receiving threats there, and Harvin, can be hit or miss. Clay, is going to, work those shorter routes, those intermediate routes, and, be a little easier for Tyrod to target. And so he might just be an every week starter at this point. I like the other tight end in this matchup, Delaney Walker. Again, a week more to get healthy. And even, when he was kind of questionable in his last game before the bye, he still put up a good performance. It's pretty clear that Mariota likes throwing to him. And, this is a good matchup. I will also say that Kendall Wright could be a nice play here. He's inside my top 24, but not mentioned as a start because I think, most people have Wright ranked that high. On the sit side, Antonio Andrews, not a guy I'm excited about. He kind of, had that mini breakout before the bye, but, the Titans have shown that they are willing to shuffle these running backs in and out for seemingly no damn reason. And I don't think you can trust Andrews. Even if you did, invest the waiver capital to pick him up, the matchup here is pretty rough. Buffalo only ranks 28th in terms of DVOA. I think that's not entirely indicative of how good their defense is. I would avoid Andrews if possible. Next up, Arizona and Detroit. We saw what the Seahawks did to this Detroit offense. Detroit is at home this week, which should help, but the Arizona defense is also very good. I don't really like Detroit's prospects of getting their first win. I think that Arizona, coming off of that loss in St. Louis, has a little bit of something to prove here. They might come into this game with a chip on their shoulder, especially, with Patrick Patterson being able to possibly lock down Calvin Johnson. That could create some, problems for the Detroit offense. And by that token, I'm recommending a sit of Stafford and Golden Tate. Once again, 2 weeks in a row. These guys, I just don't think you can use them. And I know that some of you may have drafted these guys as starters, but their offensive line is not good enough to make them starters right now. And in a matchup like this where the opposing defense is very good, we're talking about the third-ranked defense overall in terms of DVOA, 6th against the pass, 5 against the rush. This is not a good matchup for the Lions, and you need to avoid these guys if you can help it. I talked about this being a potentially bad game for Calvin Johnson. I don't think I would sit him if I had him, if only because Stafford does still seem willing to force feed Megatron targets. But, maybe you want to gamble a little bit. You want to go somewhere else with that wide receiver spot in your lineup. I mean, Calvin hasn't looked as good as he has in previous years. I couldn't totally blame you for moving away from him. But with that said, I can't recommend outright sitting him this week. Let's move now to New England and Dallas. New England heavy favorites on the road here. A big over-under, too, 50 points. Should be, another high-scoring game for the Patriots offense. I think you're starting every piece of it that's relevant. Gronkowski, Edelman, Brady are no-brainers. Dion Lewis, I think, is kind of entered into no-brainer territory. He just got a contract extension. It's clear that the Patriots like what he brings to the table. I think LeGarrette Blount fits the bill here too, just like he did in the previous game. Lewis may be the guy who gets the most touches, but Blount's going to come in there on the goal line carries. And in a high-scoring game like this, or a game where the Patriots could jump out to a big lead and just try to, run out the clock with, high percentage runs, Blount is a guy that figures to be well used in this game. Darren McFadden is a guy I'm avoiding. I know that Lance Dunbar is hurt, and that should open up more opportunities for McFadden, but this just seems like a bad matchup. Dallas is probably going to have to throw a lot in this game, and I don't think that bodes well for McFadden. I doubt many people were, itching to start DMC, but just avoid him if you were even considering it. Look somewhere else. Try to find some other play with a little bit more upside. I mean, even a guy like David Johnson or Benny Cunningham, guys who figure to be pushed out of their committees by other running backs who are kind of coming more to the forefront. But, they just have more ability to bust off big plays. I don't think Darren McFadden has that. Probably not in this match. I mean, New England's rushing defense is not great. I mean, they're the 29th ranked team in terms of rushing DVOA defense. But this is more a call against McFadden than it is, about the matchup. Next up, the Broncos heading to Oakland. Denver 5-point favorites on the road, a pretty low total here, and I think that's indicative of the Denver defense. I'm going to say start Ronnie Hillman again. He seems to be the back to own for the Broncos. And I'm also going to say start Owen Daniels. He's in my top 10 at tight ends this week. I don't like Owen Daniels, but the Raiders have been torched by these guys before. I do have a little bit of concern that Peyton Manning might just throw to Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders all game. Kind of like my recommendation against Ty Montgomery last week with the Packers, thinking that, Aaron Rodgers could just target his, primary receivers in a good matchup. But I do think that Daniels has opportunity to perform well in this game. And if the game really gets into garbage mode, Virgil Green's another guy I like for very, very deep consideration. The question mark is very crucial in this note here. You don't necessarily want to look to start Virgil Green, but if you are desperate, if you're in a 20-team league or something, and you need to, throw a dart, Virgil Green, could get there. You might see him score a touchdown or something. I'm fading basically all of the Oakland players in this game. The Denver defense is so good. Derek Carr, Michael Crabtree, the two most notable. I am curious to see how Amari Cooper does in this matchup because, we've heard rumblings of how he could be, quote-unquote matchup proof, and I want to see how that factors into this game because this is a true test against a very good opponent. How will Derek Carr do? How will Amari Cooper do in this terrible matchup? CJ Anderson, what can I say? I was high on him in the preseason, and Hillman appears to be the guy. This matchup is fine for the Oakland running game, for the Denver running game, but Anderson just hasn't shown it yet, and I do think that it has a lot to do with turf toe, the injury that he sustained early on in the season. That injury lingers. I'll keep bringing it up because I think that people keep dismissing that as a potential reason why Anderson has not looked good. So I'm avoiding him this week. He's a sit. Sunday Night Football is next. The Niners and the Giants. Giants 7-point favorites, 43 total. This tells us that Vegas does not expect the 49ers to score many points in this game. And what that means is that the New York Giants defense is a great streaming candidate. I was surprised to see them as low owned as they were coming into, the waiver period after week 4. I'm sure that's changed by now. The Giants are, a very popular pickup. I've picked them up in a couple leagues, and in the leagues where I didn't pick them up, I saw my league mates picking them up. If you still have time to grab them, this is an awesome opportunity to play a nice matchup for your defense. Eli Manning is a guy I'm starting here. Odell Beckham's an obvious guy, but Manning is a top 10 option for me in week 5. On the flip side, Colin Kaepernick, Anquan Boldin, Vernon Davis, stay away. Don't trust these 49ers passing options until you see them do anything. The Giants have actually been the best team against the rush in terms of DVOA, so you may also want to temper your expectations around Carlos Hyde. With that said, I do think that Carlos Hyde, in terms of talent, can beat a good rushing defense, but the matchup, the game flow could really take him out of this game and make him a non-factor. I probably have him ranked too high the more I look at this DVOA ranking, but we'll see. Check back with the rankings closer to Sunday, see if those have moved up or down. Last, for the Monday night game, we have the Steelers going into San Diego. San Diego, traditional 3-point favorites. Early money came in on them. They're up to -120, or at least as of the last time I checked this line, that's where it was at. Mediocre total of 45.5 points. I love the Chargers passing game here. Phillip Rivers, the newly off suspension Antonio Gates. I think Keenan Allen's possibly a top 5 receiver this week. The Pittsburgh defense is pretty bad. They ranked 16th against the pass in terms of DVOA, but we've seen other passing attacks light them up. The aforementioned Kenny Britt put up numbers against this defense, and Rivers is a legit quarterback. I like Gates. Malcolm Floyd is supposed to play. Stevie Johnson sounds like he won't play. And with that in mind, I do think Ladarius Green is an interesting play here too. Even though Gates is back, Green should still stay involved to some extent. To how much, I don't know. But, he's not a bad option if you're looking for a tight end who, maybe got dropped because Gates was coming back. Green could still have a good week. This is a nice matchup for him. On the sit side, Melvin Gordon, I just don't know how to deal with this guy. I feel like every time I say he's not going to do anything, he does okay. And every time I expect him to go off, the Chargers flip the script on me. I do think it'll be easier to pass against this Pittsburgh defense. Again, 16th in DVOA and defense, whereas they're 8th against the run. So Gordon's a guy I'm avoiding. I expect this to be more of a Danny Woodhead game. I'm also recommending a sit of Heath Miller here. I do think that Vic has hurt his value. His targets have gone way down since Roethlisberger got hurt. I think the return of Martavis Bryant is not good for Miller. Just in general, this is not a good spot to be using him when there's so many other possible viable tight ends. In general, this feels like a matchup where Pittsburgh's going to want to control the ball with some short passes and a lot of running with Le'Veon Bell. The Chargers are going to try to go the other way, pass the ball, chuck it, score a lot of points, and force Vic into passing situations. So, I mean, maybe that does bode well for Heath Miller, but it just seems like Vic has no interest in throwing to him. Until I've seen otherwise, I'm going to avoid him. He's a sit. And that wraps things up for this week's Start Sits video. Be sure to check out, again, all these links that pertain to whatever you're trying to figure out. Fantasy points against, scoring leaders, betting lines. I should note that these lines are from earlier in the week. I tend to, look them up on Tuesday or Wednesday. I might update them from time to time, or individual lines that shift a lot. But in general, after I post the lines, I don't check them again before I record the video. So make sure these haven't moved too much. And if they have moved, that can tell you stuff about these games. In general, if you have any other interest in, how the Vegas betting lines affect the outcomes of fantasy games or the prospects of fantasy games, I highly recommend Jeff Dumont's Vegas previews at the Fake Football. He posts those every Friday or Saturday, and there's a link to those here as well. Last up, Denny Carter's Streaming Defenses article. He does a lot of good work there with those streaming recommendations, which are based on the Vegas numbers, based on some other factors. So make sure to check all that stuff out, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks for watching. Adios.